Ladies and gentlemen, it is my enormous pleasure to greet you to another panel of today's conference devoted to how gender theories recall Marxist theories, the theory of war, of class war. For starters, let me introduce my speakers, Ms. Marianowicz-Szczygieł, Mr. Dariusz Rozwadowski, Mr. Robert Tekieli, and Mr. Grzegorz Strzemecki. My name is Karolina Pawłowska. I was part of Order Juris for a number of years and the new academic initiative Collegium Intermarium. Also, in my scientific research, I've always been very interested in the impact of modern political doctrine on our institutional realities and cultural realities. So I'm very happy to host this panel. By way of introduction, before we move to the contents, I'd like to give you a few remarks by way of introduction to lead us into this discussion. Well, we have seen that ever more strongly antagonistic ideas are being put into our public debate, and one of these is the gender ideology. I like this panel to focus on this ideology. Let's try and identify this ideology's doctrinal foundation, and let's ask the question of the problems noticed by the gender ideology, and let's see to what extent they're the result of today's social order that today's left wants to combat, and to what extent it's been generated by modernity as such. First, I'd like to ask Ms. Marianowicz-Szczygieł, to what extent does gender ideology translate into relationships between men and women? I know that you, as psychologists, are strongly engaged in the research into relationships between men and women, and we know that one of the assumptions of the ideology of gender is that men and women have forever been part of class war, and what they represent should not be seen as complementary, but rather as oppressive. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be in this distinguished group. If we're talking about the war, the gender war, we are talking about two things: gender ideology and feminism. I would say that the root is rather feminism, and the gender ideology is built on top of that later on. And they tend to oppose one another. Where feminism had to oppose the gender ideology. I'd like to comment on feminism. If you allow me, I would like to quote a few psychological arguments illustrating the absurdity of the ideology of gender. If we're talking about feminism, I must say that I am not a feminist, and I see myself as distancing myself from feminism, but I do see the issues that women have. Let's start with the beauty and the wisdom of the sexes, and the knowledge and wisdom and the beauty encoded in man and in woman. We are complementary to one another. And I'm thinking that this gender war simply ignores our unique capacities, our features that are complementary to one another's, thanks to which we can build a community and drag civilization forward. By antagonizing genders one against another, we lose time. If I may, I would like to show you a few slides to show you how far we've gone with feminism. If I may. Right, I've got it here. Does it work? Right. This is a strategy in the United Nations. It covers genders. But interestingly, it covers countries of the third world, let's say, and Western countries at the same time, where issues of women are completely different. In those less developed countries, they have rather issues with self-fulfillment and going outwards, while in the Western world these have already been met. And the aspirations of suffragettes have been met. So their needs are completely different, and modern culture has turned its back on maternity, like Warsaw on the Vistula River for a decade. This is an EU strategy, gender equality, another big international organization. I think I skipped one. Global Gender Gap Report, a flagship idea of the gender gap in salaries. I tried to look into how that was calculated. It's very suspicious. I didn't find the method of calculation. I do agree that there might be differences, but it's really not very transparent. This is a scheme. I think Iceland ranks first in terms of equity of salary. These are recommendations of the University of Warsaw in terms on non-discrimination, non-discriminatory language. This is a project of the Congress of Women, which is a leftist feminist organization. This is a snapshot from the Polish universities. Feminitives are one of the flagship projects. Sorry, I lost something. The way to calculate this salary gap between genders raises some methodology-wise questions, and why should the share of women in the labor market be seen as a ratio, as an indicator of equality in the market. This is an oversimplification to say that the share should be 50-50 when women to men. Let me go back to this slide that you already saw a glimpse of, because I'd like to have an intellectual look at Marxism that covers LGBT, gender and feminism ideologies. Because there's a philosophical issue in this area. So I have prepared this scheme. The starting point is an unfairness, lack of justice, which is seen selectively. It's in the form of feeling others feeling guilty in order to hide a certain manipulation, a certain selectivity in approach. The next stage is basic conflict, that is, two classes, social classes, fighting one against the other, LGBT against the rest of society, men against women, queer persons against the rest of society. This is based on a psychological mechanism of projection of hatred. So what's really painful is this lack of trust, this subtle venom that is being introduced into the society. Then there's the generalization of responsibility. All men are bastards. This is what it all boils down in terms of feminism. Right. A stronger word has been used by one of the audience. Of course, it's easier to say for a woman that's been abused that all men are pigs, or the other way around, because women tend to be aggressive as well. Then we have the emancipation based on catchy slogans which undermine the social order. In Marxism, the assumptions of economic calculation and the resources, the capital, was undermined, while in feminism, the division between sexes, the genders, is what is brought into question in order to question the whole social order. Then linguistic messianism. This is the example of feminitives. So if we start using these special language forms for 235 genders, we all will be at peace and love one another, which is absurd and oversimplifying. Then irrationality. Nobody asks the question of what homosexuality is. Nobody asks about its source, about psychological and social differences between men and women. We go straight to saying, you owe us something, you should give us something back. And this leads directly to some kind of dictatorship and injustice. So this shows you how many points of gender and feminism, because this mechanism is general, and how many points it's so distant from rational thinking. To show you this from another point of view, psychology, and this is some being negated by gender and feminism, points directly to differences between genders. And everybody who carries out a psychological text has a scale of femininity, masculinity, because that's clear in the research. Of course, in many spheres these differences were not noticed or they were minimal, but in some key areas these differences are very visible. For example, men have better spatial orientation, are more task-oriented, are more aggressive. Women are better at languages, more relationship-oriented, more empathetic, and more willing to compromise. They are easier to persuade, and they have better coordination. What does this mean, and why am I talking about this? Well, pretending that these differences are not there is irrational. And above all, this makes it impossible to manage this diversity and to use these unique skills. Let me give you two examples, if I may take up a little bit more of your time. Examples of the 18th century. Reading through source documentation from the age. Then an assessment of the reign of Stanisław August. He was surrounded by women. And this was mentioned, and I wondered, Stanisław August was an amateur of women, and his contemporaries came to the conclusion that if he lived in a different time, he would have been a great king. He was very well educated, was a supporter of the arts, but he was not tough in negotiation. Another example, the first minister of August III did not send to diplomatic missions any of his 4 sons. He sent Amelia Mieszkówna. Why? She was extremely well educated. She knew 6 languages. She had secret missions to fulfill in Vienna, Dresden, and other courts. She knew who slept with whom you have to talk to, and who is the best source of information, and she was extremely effective. So, gentlemen, if in politics you want to have an agreement beyond divides, it's better to send a woman. While when you need hard negotiation, it's better to send a man, so you need to manage the diversity instead of antagonizing the genders. And I'm talking statistics here because femininity and masculinity are a continuum. Namely, although men are statistically better at one thing and women at the other statistically, there are men who are more feminine than many women, and vice versa. So that's why I'm talking about statistics and about complementary character. I'm about to hand over. Please let me finish.
So what strikes me in feminism? The fact that the history provides some simplification. The patriarchate doesn't count with the historical facts. I'm not a historian myself, but I try to have some orientations. And in the 18th century, hunting was not only entertainment, it was also about catching animals to win some meat. So councils, it was not a task for women because of patriarchate, because it was a drinking party and guys were fighting. So ladies preferred to stay safe and sound. When it comes to the way of traveling, there were no passengers ships that required loading and unloading, pack your baggage, sometimes help. Sometimes people were sleeping in the very same place when parties were organized. So it was not the place for women. Wars and fighting was a real slaughter. And when it comes to home, there were no washing machines and dishwashers. You couldn't go to the supermarket to buy some butter. You needed to provide material, fabric for to sew clothes. So the split of the division of tasks, it reflected the level of social development. So saying that it was the male domination, it's a misunderstanding. There's a Marxist simplification, and it was untrue from historical perspective. But of course, I have to agree that the women's potential was not used at the time, but it was not related to Christianity. Greece was the land of democracy, and ladies were living in separate rooms in the house. They were assisted during walks, and they had their faces covered. That shows some historical ignorance. And the last thing, I know I take too much of your time, but my postulations, because I don't want to leave you without these thoughts. I said that feminism is not dealing with real women problems, and women are under repression. They pay other women to bring their children. This is the paradox of modern times. The part-time job may be a solution that was implemented in solution. The student can work part-time and a woman can work part-time. It's not like that women raising kids do not have any competence. They are home managers. Full insurance for full-time mothers. Grants and scholarships, not only for people below the 35 years of age, because if somebody wants to raise their kids longer, they don't have access to such financing. Including the time spent with kids to retirement age, the family judges and family courts, because real tragedies are taking place there. And now let me hand back to the moderator. Thank you very much for your take. I think that you have tackled a few important issues, and that's going to be a great introduction to our debate. I would like to point out one significant thing, one remarkable element with regard to how institutions and how law and to what extent the human rights perceive the Marxists, are perceived by Marxist ideologies and other modern ideologies. I'm under the impression that something that merges, that brings these ideologies together, is the assumption that a human being is capable of getting to know all principles governing this world and to program this world according to some principles in a way so it functions correctly. Some thinkers thought directly that the essence of modern times and all modern thoughts is the so-called gnosis, so the approach that a human being, especially the chosen one, is able to get an access to this real knowledge. And I think that gender ideology and feminism, Marxism, or Lgbt ideology are to some extent an example of this way of thinking. So we think that there will be some rules and principles imposed top-down, that some structures will be developed, social structures will be developed, and we will create a heaven on earth. And we know that the heaven is not possible to be here on earth. So how to understand this gender ideology? Is it going to be a recipe for the pains of this world? I would like to ask these questions to editor Tekieli. The topic of our today meeting is the clash between the class fight and sex fight, sex war. So, from historical point of view, we're dealing with a kind of mechanism. So it was assumed that the workers will overturn the system when Marx was writing his dissertation, and it appeared that workers didn't change the image of this world. People who were making their living on preparing revolution wanted to come up with something different in order to, and they came up with the idea that the youth will overturn the establishment, and it started in 1968. These people, the revolutionists, they designed the new stage of revolution as workers failed and the labor force failed, so they switched and turned to the youth. And the situation was also reflected in the 20s. There was an ideological proposal. One psychologist, one psychiatrist who was Freud's pupil, he wrote a book, The Sexual War of Youth, and he suggested to sexualize young kids. And that's the element that was promoted in the Soviet Union when he tried to be active, he failed, because in the communist country the sexual revolution was stopped. In 1920, Miss Kołłątaj prepared everything what happened in 1968, so full sexual liberty. There were also some suggestions. There were some projects to replace governments, and there was even time assigned for that change. So the whole time of transition of this burden from workers to the youth took a very difficult path. Today we're dealing with another emanation of Marxism, and as you've said, there are three main streams: LGBT, feminism, and gender ideology. Sexual minorities took the place of the youth, and males are opposed to females. Here we have two ways how revolutionists act. On one hand, they try to build the no-sex society. There are some activities being proposed that lead that in England about 17–18% of children don't know their sex, their gender. And this is a result of the cultural revolution that took over in the Western countries. And all that led to this situation. This situation will worsen. Neo-Marxist environments, like Marxist environments, think that church is their opponent. Mary Magdalene is their hero, and Saint Paul is their enemy, as he defined the role of woman and man in the marriage. So that is the proposal and method of acting. Margaret Sanger offered that. So not only was she racist, she supported Nazis in Germany, and of course, additionally, she was a feminist. And she set up Planned Parenthood organization that is active and that operate abortion clinics. Most of them are constructed and are located on the outskirts of the black neighborhoods. The natural function of woman she's a leverage undermining basic social mechanisms. Another element of attack on church is the women becoming priests. So that's a blast against what Jesus said, that only males should be priests. So that's also a step towards blurring the difference between sexes. So what is the aim of all these activities? One foundation of the Western civilization is a monogamous relationship between a woman and a man. Before Christianity, in the ancient times, there was no division into male and female, only an active and passive side. So sex with young children, with adolescents. It was something which was socially acceptable. The idea of marriage between a male and female channeled sexuality only to these situations that caused that the energy that was hidden in society, that was dispersed into sex with anyone and without any limitations, this energy was forged into the fact that the Western civilization dominated the world for several hundreds of years. And gender hegemony is the very person who, and here once again, we can see them aiming at blurring the difference between male and female in order to internalize this idea. So that person, the guy I was telling you about, was a psychiatrist, and there was a situation of two little kids, and one of them, due to some accident, he lost part of his penis. And this injured boy, when he was 3 or 4, he had some problems. And he started to go to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist offered to raise him as a girl. And this experiment was described in popular media as a success. But what happened then? But in real life, this boy was playing only with boyish toys. He went to the men's room, and when he was 14 and they tried to apply hormonal therapy, he rejected that, and another psychologist described the whole situation and the scientific environment to react to this case, to this problem, and to this harm done to this little boy. And what happened next? This boy, who happened to become a girl, he became an adult male. He had a woman, and that ended up in tragedy because he committed a suicide. So it's like with an absurd research of Kingsley that helped to develop the theory, which was verified in practice negatively. The West was smashed by these neo-Marxist movements. You can go to jail if you don't want to send your kids to masturbation classes. You can end up in jail because you are praying in front of the abortion clinics. The hope is there is some hope that this Marxist movement is against the nature and against the culture. And to me, that leaves some hope. Because always reality that is driven into absurd, it reacts. So to sum up, absolutely such theories, they do not lead to heaven on earth, but they backfire and they lead to tragedies. And now I think that what you've said is also a great starting point to ask another question that I wanted to ask to Dr. Peter Bernatowicz. To what extent gender culture and gender theory affects the culture, and how we can counteract such phenomena in the interplay with the current culture and arts. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. Maybe let me respond to this question: what is the relationship between the theory, the gender ideology, and the culture, and why do we need this culture? Why the gender ideology needs that culture? But maybe let me start from a short explanation what I'm going to talk about and how I understand the concept and the theory, the gender theory. So first and foremost, I understand it as a political problem, not like the cognitive problem or cognitive method. Of course, you can define the term of the definition of cultural gender as a cognitive tool. You can find out how it emanated in the public in history, but within traditional disciplines, you can consider such topics there under consideration. And but what is treated in gender studies as gender culture? This is to me, it's a cultural phenomenon, because the aim is to lead to some political changes, which it will be implemented through the change of institutions, social institutions mainly. And the gender ideology concentrates several areas. As editor Tekieli said, it's feminism, LGBT is. These are several groups. You have gays, transsexuals plus, queer, and other groups, some minorities. So, if we take a closer look at these minorities, let me focus on the group which is considered as LGBT. And let me ask 3 questions I asked myself before this conference in the context of the title of this panel, which is the relationship between the Marxism, gender, LGBT, and so on. So these questions are as follows. The first question may be quite an obvious one, but I came to think it's worth asking it. Has Marxism anything to do with LGBT? What is the relationship between Marxism and LGBT? What is the nature of this relation, and why LGBT movements need Marxism? Do they need it at all? And the third question, what culture has to do with that, and why the cultural component is required here? And to respond to the first questions, what is the relationship between Marxism and LGBT? I came to thinking, after some research and looking at the issue from the political perspective, from the perspective of political change, and I came to thinking that the beginnings of formulating something like minority or group treated as a community under oppression, it's related to Comintern policy in the second part of the 20s and in the 30s. It has more to do with interpretation or reinterpretation of Marxism by Stalin. So these roots are in the Stalin concepts. Why? Because there are two problems, two political reinterpretations of Marxism implemented by Stalin. So the first one is introducing national minorities. Stalin described how a nation is perceived from the Marxist perspective, that the nation has some economic factor, cultural language, and geographical context, and he did it in order to leave the dogmatic Lenin-like politics or Trotsky-like politics and perception of society and perception of revolution as something done by the labor force, by the laborers. And then some problems of some groups, for example, women under patriarchy. So revolution is key. Revolution performed by the working party, and of course not in the Soviet Union. It didn't concern the Soviet Union itself. So the state can be very oppressive for gays. They implemented penalization. They penalized homosexuals. But this minorities, the concept that was supposed to be the foundation, for example, to leave the black minority as a nation opposing the U.S. government as persecuted nation, and homosexuals, American homosexuals. We have Harry Hay. They started to treat homosexuals, which were not treated well by communists, because communists perceived them as perverts. But the concept of national minorities became the basis for creation something like cultural minority. So not all conditions of a nation were fulfilled, because there is no territory. Of course, it might be interpreted in different manners, but the language and culture. So these two elements, language is something really interesting, because it's not only about the verbal language, it's about body language as well, so some specific language. But it's not in its verbal version, not to go into details with this analysis. So on this basis, on the basis of this Stalin idea, they come up with something like cultural minorities. So homosexuals were described as a group which is under oppression, which might fight for liberation hand in hand with communists. And the second Stalin conception, it was the People's Front. So leaving the concept of political party and focus on the group that fight for a global revolution. And Stalin implemented this People's Front to build some coalition of different political parties and environments opposing fascism. And the whole coalition of different groups, different minorities, sexual minorities, gay, lesbians, feminists, and so on, reflects, it's an exact, or racial minorities, is an exact reflection of this Stalin concept of People's Front. So when going back to the roots of it, we can state it clearly. Even this rainbow flag, it's a kind of merger of different groups. It's a community where differences are insignificant, but there is one enemy, fascism. So if fascism was beaten, you have to reanimate it in order to keep the consistent group. Of course, this happened in the 50s when Stalin or the Communist Party referred to Stalin's authority after 1955 when Stalin died. This Stalin concepts stopped to be comfortable. But the roots are the same. The whole concept taken from the interpretation of Marxism by Stalin are the basis for that. And that's something that we're experiencing now. So moving towards the second question, is Marxism needed for LGBT? I think no. I think that like Stalinism stopped being important in the 50s after 1985, despite the fact that there were some attempts to reactivate Marxism. It is insignificant as it doesn't serve as good legitimization. Today, Marx is not known there is more and more conservative journalists who use it. It's not any legitimization, it's a problem. Stalin is a problem because what happened? What became legitimization for LGBT and gender movements, universities and culture? These are two areas, not political ideology, not politics itself. Politics or political ideology stopped to be any kind of legitimization for these environments. They cooperate with universities when gender studies are something really popular also in Poland, so that we jump to a conclusion that if something is to be done with that, we need to start with gender studies and the culture. So the cultural institutions legitimizing these movements and these movements of sexual minority, they do not require any politics. I'm under the impression that modern left-leaning parties, they need these movements in order to legitimize themselves. If you take a look at these party programs, the only ideological backyard of them is these are minorities like gender and LGBT movements. So we might come to such conclusions, and cultures, what has culture to do with that? It's one of the major sources of legitimization of this ideology. So there is something like cultural minority. This is the concept that was developed based on national minorities, that we have to do not only with the minority which is based on some specific conditions, economic or others, or it has its own territory, but the culture and language became the main factors legitimizing and assigning give identity to these groups. They form them as and something complete. They become a group, making some statements that should be respected and being acknowledged by society. To be honest, we have 10 minutes and we have 2 speakers. Okay, so maybe I will add it later on. Okay, so let's leave some time for comments. We have said about ideological support. We've been talking about similarities between gender, feminism, and war of classes. I'd like to ask, because I know that Dariusz Rozwadowski joined us online, How do you perceive these issues? I know that you're an author of books on cultural Marxism. How do you perceive this penetration of this ideology into institutions and politics? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm happy I could join you. That's great to participate in such conferences. I'd like to point out on some revolutionary strategies. When we talk about gender ideology and sexual minorities, I'd like to point out that we are dealing with a change of revolutionary concept. This is the change of proletariat. In classical Marxism, these were workers who were supposed to be revolutionists, but when the time has come, the Marxists wanted to carry out revolution during the First World War, but the workers failed. And they started to think what went wrong, why the revolution failed, and the reason behind this failure was supposed to be the culture. And I wouldn't point out Stalin, and I would not agree with what you said. I would tell about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian, and George Lukács from Hungary, who reversed the revolution. They said that key for revolution is that in order that revolution will be successful if there are some changes will be implemented in the culture. And still, this is the goal of Marxists. Another goal is economic change. But it has been seen that first and foremost, the cultural hegemony should be achieved. And these issues were started in Frankfurt and the so-called Frankfurt School. So this institute converted Marxism and from economic issues to cultural issues. And some concepts, some strategy that was defined in the 20s by the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, so-called Long March Through Institutions. It was implemented in the 60s, and Gramsci's dissertations and his concept were discovered in the 60s, and this is the time when proletariat was replaced. Herbert Marcuse mentioned that proletariat should be replaced, that the workers failed, and he started to point out some minorities like sexual minorities and also women and feminism. I would take a step further and I would indicate on some links between Marxism and feminism that were described by Friedrich Engels in his work from 1884. His dissertation on the origins of family in the light of research of Louis Morgan, Engels indicated on common interest of Marxism and feminism. And the essence of this dissertation boiled down to one thing, that the quintessence of capitalist abuse is the abuse of women by a male in patriarchy. So the condition to have equal society is to liquidate the basis for these inequalities resulting from social roles imposed by an unjust social system. So at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, there was no mention of gender, but in the Marxist environments, it started to become even more popular. Than social inequalities come from some social norms which are imposed on human beings by society in the process of upbringing in order to create a new man. These norms should be reversed and should be abolished by equal upbringing. So the sexual issues started to be linked with revolution from the very beginning, and also in works of Engels and Marx we can discover it. And then on the basis of some revision and revolution in the beginning of 20th century failed by the communists, captured the power in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Russia, but they maintained this power only by having recourse to acts of violence. And once again, Antonio Gramsci pointed out that here it's not all about imposing something and forcing societies to anything, but to lead to a situation when we win their voluntary consent. So it was about changing the mindset and to people accepting revolution as something which is progressive and valuable and needed. And it was in order to achieve the cultural hegemony, and that was supposed to be a peaceful revolution, because acts of terror and acts of violence proved inefficient. And revolution in the 60s, in 1968, since 1968, the Long March to the institutions was implemented. It was about permeating into the core of institutions. It was not about collapse of these institutions and getting rid of them, but it was to use the authority of the institution in order to spread the revolutionary message. And what is even more important, also from our point of view, and with reference to gender ideology, in 1997, the Amsterdam Treaty was adopted and came into force in 1999, and the European Union adopted as its main social and cultural policy so-called gender mainstreaming. So this is our reality. We have to be aware of that. That when the EU, Poland entered the EU, we didn't discuss these issues, and we have to be aware that these are concepts that are being implemented. And one of my four speakers pointed out that the West was hijacked by this neo-Marxist ideology, and we have to be aware that this is our reality, and the pressure on implementation of these gender concepts will become even more powerful. Thank you very much.
I think what you said about the march across the institutions is of particular importance. This is why I'd like to address the last question of this debate to Mr. Strzemecki, who indeed is a specialist in gender and permeation of gender issues to Polish law, and he has been one for a number of years. So could you share your knowledge about the issue and quote some obvious examples from the Istanbul Convention as an example of this permeation of the ideology into our legal system, of this class war? Sure. Thank you very much. Above all, thanks for having me on this great conference among these distinguished speakers. I hope I will not disappoint you. Although using this very broad and varied panoramic, I'll try and have a bird's eye view. Although there might be time for details, I hope. For starters, I'd like to raise the following issue. I don't remember whether it was Marcuse's book or his correspondence. It was about the financing of this march. That is, who has financed this? But this question is later to be answered. I like to start with very elementary questions, regardless of general frameworks being delineated by this march across institutions. The plan of play was written by Marcuse in 1965, and it seems to me that it's underappreciated, underestimated. As plan of 1965 is precisely the plan to take away civic rights from most in the name of defense of the rights of the minority. It's about blurring the meaning of the words used by reasonable people, reasoning people. These reasoning are to rule and not the minorities. At the end of the day, although they are being used to fell the rule of the majority. So this should make you think. If we're talking about this war, we should start by defining who combats whom. This is a natural question if we have this analogy of the class war with gender war. And the ideology we're talking about is a certain thought construct built in the name of, for the needs of the one waging the war. Certainly this is a spiritual war, and this spiritual war translates into a war against the spiritual element of evil. We confront the creation of intellect in the form of an ideology that translates that evil into specific language, in the form, among others, of those who execute that ideology and put it into practice. We know who is the father of lie. So from this point of view, this Christian perspective, the Christian analysis, is completely identical to the absolutely rational perspective without any reference to religious beliefs. This is, referring back to the discussion about whether religion allows for rationality. All of this is to take place in the EU. And the reality is always complex and multidimensional. So what attacks Poland? That's what's interesting to us. Is not only Marxism, which we see so clearly in the European Parliament, but also this ideology of German Herrenvolk. As the Russian despotism. And this Russian despotism has an ally in the EU. So through the EU we are being attacked by three separate forces. So this is general class or cultural war, which results to be a fight of Marxism, German nationalism, and Russian despotism at the same time. Marxism plays an important role in the whole picture, of course. Like we said, the intellectual entity is there, and who does it serve? Because Marxism was about empowering the working class. Of course, it does not empower, it makes it an object rather than a subject. So what is Marxism? It's an ideology of capturing power through brainwashing the people and through terror. So that brainwashing is in different proportions to terror. In neo-Marxism, the brainwashing is a more important as strand, but there is ever more terror. If we're talking about this brainwashing, we can refer to Herbert Marcuse back again, 1 year before the essay Repressive Tolerance. He published One-Dimensional Man. And there's a sentence that says the logic of Marxist dialectics cancels the philosophy of the transcendental philosophy, direct experience, and formal logic, or logic as such. So it's to cancel logic and facts. That's the tool for brainwashing. We see on a daily basis that facts and logic do not count at all. So if we're talking about this paradox, the absurd, the nonsense, they are by no mistake, by no error. Please excuse me, because the organizers are letting me know that our time is running out. So the question is, who is operating this brainwashing? If we take a press mention of who finances the Gay Pride Parade in New York, apparently it's all the American corporations. Well, to be brief and summarize this, let me tell you that it seems that Marxism is just a tool, an ideologic tool, for capturing absolute power through the brainwashing of societies. And it is being managed and funded by the biggest international corporations. Chosen segments of science are being used as tools by this big capital and multinational corporations. So apparently we have two final conclusions. One is the following. This story repeats itself because Marx and Marxists are a tool in the hands of this huge, gigantic capital. And number two, we're going back to the old conflict, since these multinationals are fighting their only possible enemy, that is democratic nation states and simple private property, small, medium, that can face up to it. So these climate absurds have as goal putting an end to those nation states and this private property. So the history repeats itself, because it's the same conflict we saw in ancient Greece. It's democracy against aristocracy, and the Roman people against the aristocracy. So contemporary demos populace cannot face up to the destruction of civilization. Sorry, I did not mention the convention. Right, that's, don't worry about that. This was a great summary. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you for taking part in this panel, and I encourage you to continue the dialogue informally off the stage. So now let's have a brief break. Thank you.